Welcome to Founding Chronicles. If you love powerful stories from America's past, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our history journeys. Let's step back into one of the most astonishing chapters of World War II. A story so ironic, so unbelievable, that you might think it was a myth. But it's true. They came to America as shadows of men gaunt, hungry, beaten down by years of war. The German prisoners of war who stepped onto American soil in the 1940s looked nothing like the terrifying image painted in the newspapers and propaganda reels. These weren't invincible Nazi supermen. Many were little more than skeletons wrapped in rags, their eyes sunken, their ribs pressing out against paper-thin skin. Some weighed barely 120 pounds, despite standing well over 6 feet tall. The once proud soldiers of the Afrika Korps, the very men who had marched under Rommel across the burning sands of North Africa, shuffled off American transport ships looking more like survivors of famine than warriors of the Reich. They were hungry, achingly hungry, and yet they did not know what awaited them in Germany. Their families back home starved on watery soups and turnip bread. Mothers tore scraps of wallpaper from walls to boil for the starch that might keep children alive another day. Cities smoldered under Allied bombs. Meat was a forgotten dream. In the Reich's final years, even the most loyal party officials could not find enough to eat. But in America, something very different was waiting. The land of cornfields and wheat, of cattle herds and overflowing orchards, was prepared to feed these same enemy soldiers like kings better, in fact, than most American civilians ate during those very same years of rationing. It sounds almost impossible to believe, and yet the record is clear. Between 1942 and 1946, over 425,000 German POWs were held in nearly 700 camps scattered across the United States. From Texas cotton fields to the forests of Wisconsin, from the plains of Nebraska to the deep pine country of Alabama, these camps became home for young men who had once vowed to die for Hitler. But instead of death, many found something far stranger: life, abundance, and in some cases, a shocking weight gain of 50 pounds or more. One prisoner, carefully documented by camp doctors, arrived weighing only 128 pounds. 2 years later, he walked out of captivity at a solid 185 pounds. How could this be? How could America, at war with Germany, pour so much food into the stomachs of captured soldiers when its own people rationed butter, sugar, and meat? Why would the United States fatten its enemies while its own soldiers bled and starved in prisoner camps across Europe? The answer lies in a strange mix of international law, American pride, and the overwhelming abundance of U.S. agriculture. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were guaranteed humane treatment. They were to be fed, clothed, and sheltered at a standard equal to the host country's own soldiers. But in America, that rule took on a very special meaning. The American soldiers' daily ration during World War II averaged 3,700 calories a day. Steaks, potatoes, bread, vegetables, coffee, even dessert when available. And so, by law, the German prisoners had to be given the same. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the food flowed. Hot meals 3 times a day, with meat, milk, butter, bread, vegetables, and coffee. Often, there was more food than a prisoner could even finish. In fact, in some camps, the men joked that they had to train their stomachs to handle the American portions. For those who had come from the famine-like conditions of Europe, the shock was almost too much. Some prisoners ate until they were sick, unable to believe the bounty placed before them was real. They gorged on white bread, soft, sweet, so unlike the coarse rye of Germany. They drank milk by the glassful, something many hadn't tasted fresh since childhood. They bit into apples and oranges as if they were priceless treasures, savoring the juice that dripped down their chins. In letters home, they wrote of meals that seemed impossible. "We eat meat every day," one prisoner confessed, "sometimes even twice a day. We have cake, butter, jam, and as much coffee as we want. Do not worry for me. Worry for yourselves." The irony was sharp, even cruel. While German prisoners in America gained weight, sometimes 50 pounds or more, German civilians wasted away. Children fainted in school from hunger. Wives bartered family heirlooms for a single loaf of bread. And back in Germany, the government told people that Americans were starving, that Allied bombings had left U.S. cities in ruins, that democracy had failed, that capitalism had collapsed. Yet the letters that trickled back from POW camps told another story. "America," one prisoner wrote, "is a land where there is food without end. They throw more away than we could ever dream of eating." And in a way, those words cut through propaganda more powerfully than bombs. Because a soldier who has eaten well, who has tasted the richness of an enemy's generosity, does not return home quite the same. Still, not every German prisoner trusted it at first. Some wondered if the food was poisoned, if it was a trick. Others refused to eat pork, fearing it had been cooked in a way that would violate their traditions. But hunger is a strong persuader. Within weeks, even the most suspicious men were scraping their plates clean, sometimes sneaking seconds if they could. Before long, the camp doctors began to notice a trend. The prisoners were not just surviving, they were thriving. Medical reports from camps in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana noted steady increases in prisoner weight. Men who had arrived thin and sickly filled out with muscle and fat. Their cheeks grew rounder. Their uniforms, once baggy, began to strain at the seams. "They are getting fat," one American guard remarked, half amused, half bitter, as he watched a group of POWs shovel hay in the sun, their bellies pressing against their shirts. It wasn't just the food. The prisoners were also put to work in America's vast agricultural fields. From the Midwest to the South, farmers faced a severe labor shortage. Millions of young American men were overseas fighting, and crops risked rotting in the fields without hands to harvest them. The solution was simple: use the German prisoners. Day after day, they worked in cotton fields, orchards, canneries, and sawmills. And the strange thing was, they ate even better there. Farmers often paid them not just in wages, but in food. Watermelons split open under the sun. Bushels of peaches passed around like candy. Cans of Coca-Cola, slices of pie, ice cream handed out by farm wives who looked at the blonde, polite boys and thought of their own sons overseas. It was a bizarre contradiction. On paper, these men were the enemy. Yet in the small towns of America, many people found themselves unable to hate the prisoners sitting across from them at the supper table. Some families even invited POW work details into their homes for Sunday dinner. There are stories of Germans sitting politely, bowing their heads as grace was said, and then digging into roast beef, mashed potatoes, and gravy with a hunger that no words could hide. For many, it was the first true family meal they had eaten in years. And so the weight piled on. 10 pounds, 20 pounds, 30 pounds. The camp records tell the story in hard numbers, but the photographs, those rare glimpses of POW life behind the fences, reveal something even more striking. Smiling young, men with cigarettes in hand, ice cream cones melting in the summer heat, faces full and healthy. Men who only months earlier had been prisoners of Hitler's failing empire now found themselves prisoners of America's abundance. It reached the point where some of them, when given the chance, refused to escape. American officials feared that thousands might try to break free, but in reality, less than 0.5% ever made a serious attempt. And why would they? Outside the wire lay uncertainty, hunger, and the risk of being hunted down. Inside was food, shelter, and safety. Inside, a man could gain 50 pounds in 2 years, could write home about Thanksgiving turkeys and Christmas pies, about Coca-Cola and chewing gum. Inside, life was not war, but something strangely peaceful. What no one fully realized at the time was that this abundance was reshaping the minds of the very men who had once sworn loyalty to the Reich. America was teaching them, not through lectures or propaganda, but through food, through kindness, through the strange act of feeding an enemy until his body grew fat and his beliefs began to soften. And so, the story of the German POWs in America is not simply about men gaining 50 pounds. It is about the astonishing power of food to break down walls. It is about irony so deep it borders on tragic comedy. The enemy of America living in captivity, eating better than the average American family at home, while his own children in Germany starved. It is about how, in the middle of the deadliest war in human history, the dinner table quietly became one of America's greatest weapons. The daily rhythm of life in America's prisoner camps soon became something the Germans had never expected: predictable, safe, and in many ways, almost comfortable. For men who had lived through the chaos of the desert campaigns, the bloody retreats across Europe, or the bitter cold of Russia, this new life felt almost unreal. The morning began with the bugle, the same way it did for American soldiers. But instead of marching into battle, the prisoners marched into mess halls. Long tables were laid out, steam rising from metal trays. Hot oatmeal or eggs, bacon if supplies allowed, toast stacked in piles, butter, jam, and coffee strong enough to wake even the most exhausted man. Sometimes there was fruit bananas, oranges, apples, delicacies that felt like luxury. For many of the Germans, it was the first time in years they had sat down to a proper breakfast. They ate in silence. At first, almost nervously. Some of the younger boys, who had been drafted straight from school into Hitler's armies, wolfed down their meals with the desperation of children who had gone too long without. Others lingered over their coffee, savoring it as though afraid it might be the last. Slowly, though, as days turned into weeks, a strange ease set in. The men began to joke again, to laugh, to push back from the table with groans of fullness. Camp doctors kept close watch, charting the remarkable weight gain that seemed to happen right before their eyes. At noon, there was lunch. Sandwiches piled high with cold cuts, thick slices of white bread, fresh lettuce, and pickles. Bowls of soup, trays of cookies, cartons of milk. For men who had marched across the sands of North Africa on nothing but dry bread and thin water, it felt like something out of a dream. In Germany, their wives and children were boiling nettles for soup. Here, they were spooning up beef stew with tender potatoes and carrots, wiping the last drops with hunks of bread so soft it nearly melted in the mouth. Dinner was the real feast. Steaks or chicken, pork chops, mashed potatoes and gravy, vegetables, buttered and salted just right, and often dessert cake, pie, sometimes even ice cream. In one camp in Nebraska, the prisoners celebrated Thanksgiving with a meal that fit any American family's table: roasted turkey, cranberry sauce, stuffing, and pumpkin pie. The men ate until their belts had to be loosened, then leaned back with sighs of disbelief. For the first time, they understood why the guards had spoken of Thanksgiving as something sacred. The irony of it all was staggering. At that very moment, Americans back home were standing in ration lines, trading coupons for small portions of sugar, meat, or butter. Housewives learned to stretch meals, to cook with powdered eggs and canned goods. Children collected tin cans and rubber for the war effort. Soldiers overseas wrote home about rations of Spam and powdered milk. Yet here, in the heart of America, the prisoners of the Reich were eating as though the war did not exist. Some guards resented it bitterly. They looked at the POWs' full plates and thought of their own children at home scraping by with ration stamps. They muttered about Krauts getting fat while we ration. But orders were orders. The Geneva Convention had to be followed, and America prided itself on being better than its enemies. "We will not starve our prisoners," one officer said, firmly, because that is what they do. We are Americans. We show the world how civilized men fight wars. And in truth, America had another reason beyond law or pride. Feeding the prisoners well was also practical. A fed man worked harder. In the fields, a fed man caused less trouble. A fed man was less likely to riot, less likely to try and escape. And work was what America desperately needed. By 1943, the labor shortage in America had reached a breaking point. With millions of men overseas, the harvests were in danger. Fields of corn, cotton, and wheat stood waiting, but there weren't enough hands to gather them. Factories needed men to can vegetables, to cut lumber, to build roads. The answer came in the barbed wire fences of the POW camps. Each morning, trucks rolled out of the camps with groups of Germans, guarded by a handful of soldiers. They went to farms and orchards, to sawmills and warehouses. They picked apples, cut timber, slaughtered cattle, and baled hay. Farmers who had once cursed Hitler now found themselves depending on his soldiers to bring in the harvest out at first. Townsfolk watched with suspicion. Here were the enemy blonde-haired, blue-eyed boys in work clothes, singing German songs as they picked cotton. Some women turned their backs, refusing to acknowledge them. But hunger does strange things to a nation, and when the crops began to rot less, when barns filled and markets stayed stocked, attitudes softened. There are countless stories of kindness exchanged in those fields. A farm wife handing out slices of watermelon on a blistering summer day. A little boy shyly offering. A German prisoner a stick of gum. A farmer pouring mugs of cold lemonade after a long day's work. In some cases, friendships formed quiet, unspoken bonds that crossed enemy lines. Farmers saw not Nazis, but young men who looked like their own sons overseas. The Germans, in turn, saw not faceless enemies, but ordinary families who lived, simply honestly, and with a warmth they had not expected. Food played its part here, too. Farmers often rewarded the prisoners with more than their rations allowed. Fresh peaches straight off the tree, pies from the kitchen, a jug of cold milk carried out to the fields. And the Germans, hungry as always, accepted with gratitude. They wrote home of these moments, describing the taste of American fruit, the sweetness of pies, the simple abundance of it all. Back in the camps, the evenings were filled with a strange peace. The men played soccer or sang songs with guitars made from scraps of wood. They wrote letters under the dim light of bulbs strung across barrack ceilings. They played chess, carved trinkets, or read books from camp libraries stocked with English and German volumes. And always they ate. Every night, the mess hall was a reminder of where they were. Not in a land of rubble and hunger, but in a place where food was so plentiful, it almost seemed endless. It began to change them. Slowly, quietly, the food and the kindness began to do what no propaganda leaflet ever could. The men started to see America not as the monster their leaders had described, but as something else. A country that had so much it could even feed its enemies. A country that offered abundance without demand for obedience. Respect without the whip of tyranny. One German officer later admitted that it was the dinners, not the lectures, that made him rethink the Reich. When you sit at a table, eating turkey with cranberry and pie, he said, you cannot believe anymore that these people are weak or starving. You see that everything you were told was a lie. And so, while bombs fell over Europe and battles raged in the Pacific, in the quiet heart of America, a quieter battle was being won, not with guns, but with bread and butter, with roast beef. And pi. The weight gain of the prisoners was more than just physical. It was symbolic. Every pound added was another crack in the wall of Nazi lies. Every inch of fat around the belly was another reminder that democracy was not weak, not starving, not collapsing. Instead, it was thriving, and it had more than enough to share, even with its enemies. But this abundance also brought guilt. Some prisoners, reading letters from starving families in Germany, felt ashamed to write back about their full stomachs. They struggled to explain how it was possible they ate better as prisoners than their families did as free men and women. Some even sent home the wages they earned from farm work, tiny amounts of money that might buy bread or potatoes if it reached Germany. But the hunger there was so vast, the need so desperate, that nothing could ease it. And so the contrast grew. Sharper, the irony deeper. In America, the enemy was gaining 50 pounds. In Germany, children were wasting away. The seasons turned, and with them came holidays that many of the prisoners had not celebrated properly in years. For the Germans, used to war-torn cities and meager rations back home, the American way of marking a holiday was almost beyond belief. It began with small gestures, extra coffee, an extra slice of bread, a farmer's wife handing out cookies at Christmas time. But soon, the camps themselves became places where abundance was not only daily life, but an occasion for celebration. Christmas was the most startling of all. In 1944, while bombs fell on German cities, the prisoners in American camps were treated to feasts that would have made any family proud. Turkeys roasted golden brown, hams glazed with honey, mashed potatoes piled high, gravy flowing, bread rolls steaming from ovens. For dessert, pumpkin pie, apple pie, even chocolate cake when it could be managed. Some camps even set up Christmas trees, decorated with paper chains and hand-carved ornaments made by the prisoners themselves. The men sang carols in their native tongue, still not, echoing softly through the barracks, while guards listened. Quietly, some moved to tears. For a brief evening, enemies were simply men remembering home, mothers, wives, children they might never see again. And all the while, their stomachs were achingly full on a holiday with their families. Back home might have had nothing more than thin soup and a crust of bread. The guilt cut deeply for many of them. Some prisoners confessed that the joy of the holiday meal was shadowed by the pain of knowing their children starved in Germany. In letters, they struggled to find the words. "We had turkey and pie," one prisoner wrote to his wife, "but I could not swallow without thinking of you. Forgive me for eating." The irony of feasting while their families starved haunted them, and yet they could not stop themselves from eating. Hunger was too old a companion. Thanksgiving, though not. A German holiday became another moment of wonder. The Americans made sure the prisoners understood its meaning. Guards explained that it was a time to give thanks for abundance, for family, for freedom. The prisoners chuckled at the irony. How could they, as captives, celebrate freedom? And yet, as they filled their plates with turkey and stuffing, cranberries and pie, they realized they were experiencing a freedom of another kind. The freedom from want. The freedom from starvation. For the first time in years, they could eat until they could eat no more. And then there was the 4th of July. In some camps, the guards allowed the Germans to watch fireworks from behind the fences. They stood in silence, gazing at the bright colors bursting over American skies. The guards cheered, families clapped, children waved flags. The prisoners watched, their bellies full from barbecue and corn on the cob handed out that afternoon. And they thought about what it meant to be part of a country that could celebrate so loudly even while fighting a world war. It was during these moments that something began to shift inside many of the Germans. They came to America convinced it was a weak land, a place where greed and capitalism had left people starving. Hitler had told them that democracy was chaos, that America was a nation of mongrels, divided and collapsing. And yet, every day in the camps, with every meal, they saw the truth. Democracy had given birth to abundance. Even in wartime, America had more than enough to feed not just its people, but its enemies as well. This realization did something no bullet could. It broke the spell of Nazi propaganda. Slowly, quietly, men began to talk among themselves. They questioned what they had been told. They wondered if perhaps the future lay not in the ruins of the Reich, but in the freedoms they saw reflected, in the generosity of the guards, the kindness of farm families, the laughter of American children. Not all accepted it, of course. Some officers clung fiercely to their ideology, preaching loyalty to Hitler even within the camps. They sneered at the abundance, calling it a trick, a way to soften the German spirit. But those voices grew weaker with every pound gained, every bite of apple pie, every sip of Coca-Cola. For the rank-and-file soldiers, who had no interest in politics beyond survival, the truth was plain. America was not starving. America was strong. Escape attempts did happen, but they were few and far between. Out of nearly 500,000 German POWs, less than 0.5% ever tried to run. And even those who did usually failed. The American countryside was too vast, the language too foreign, the locals too quick to spot a runaway. Most who slipped away were caught within days, often hiding in barns or begging for food. Incredibly, there were stories of prisoners who escaped, only to turn themselves back in, explaining that life inside the camp was easier, safer, and far better fed than life outside. One prisoner, caught after a short-lived escape attempt in Texas, told his guards bluntly, "Why should I leave? Here I have meat every day. Out there I would starve." Another man, who had once sworn to die for the Reich, admitted quietly to a fellow prisoner, "If I must be a prisoner, let it be here. This is the best prison in the world." Perhaps the strangest twist came as the war neared its end. In 1945, after Germany surrendered, many of the POWs faced the prospect of being sent back home. By then, they were heavier, healthier, and in many cases, happier than they had been in years. Some begged to stay, terrified of returning to the ruins of their homeland. They had heard the letters, read the words of hunger and despair from wives and mothers. They knew what awaited them: bombed-out cities, starvation, uncertainty. Compared to that, the barbed wire of America was a paradise, and yet the rules were clear. They would be sent back. Some went reluctantly, dragging their feet, dreading the hunger that awaited. A few wept openly as they boarded ships, knowing they were leaving behind not just safety, but abundance. It was perhaps the only time in history that men wept to leave a prison camp, but America had left its mark on them. The weight they gained was not just in their bodies. It was in their minds, in their souls. They had seen a different world, a world where food was plenty, where generosity was stronger than hatred. Many of them carried that memory back to Germany, where it planted seeds for a future no one could have imagined in 1942. And so, the story of the German POWs in America became not only a tale of weight gain, but of transformation. They arrived as hollow men, starving, bitter, filled with propaganda and fear. They left heavier, stronger, and carrying with them the undeniable truth that democracy had fed them, better than tyranny ever could. But perhaps the greatest irony of all was this: while German POWs grew fat in American camps, their families in Germany starved, and American families at home endured rationing. The enemy was eating better than both friend and foe. It was a paradox so sharp it almost defies belief. And yet it happened quietly, day after day, across 700 camps in the heart of America. When the war ended in 1945, The German prisoners of war in America stood at a strange crossroads. The guns had gone silent, the Reich had fallen, and Hitler was dead. For the men behind the fences of America, this meant only one thing: soon they would be sent home. Yet home was not the Germany they had left. It was something far worse. A nation broken, bombed, starving. Cities reduced to ashes. Families scattered. Hunger so deep that some people ate grass and weeds to survive. The contrast could not have been greater. Inside the camps, they were healthy, full, and strong. Outside, in their homeland, people wasted away. The irony was too much for many of them to bear. Men who had gained 30, 40, even 50 pounds in captivity now prepared to return to a land where food was measured in crumbs. They had gone from famine to abundance, and now they were being sent back to famine again. The departure was emotional in ways few expected. Some prisoners cried openly as they left. Others clutched keepsakes they had made in camp workshops, wood. Carvings, drawings, even scraps of paper with English words written carefully, learned from guards and farmers' children. A few even begged their captors to let them stay in America, offering to work the fields for free if it meant one more year of plenty. But the rules were unbending. By 1946, nearly all of the German POWs had been shipped back across the Atlantic, and there the real shock came. The fattened men, the ones who had once written home of Coca-Cola and ice cream, returned to families gaunt and hollow. Children did not recognize fathers. Wives wept at the sight of men who looked healthier than they had ever been, while they themselves had withered from years of hunger. The weight gain was more than a curiosity. It was a cruel reminder of what Germany had lost, and of what America had. But something else had changed too. These men returned not just heavier in body, but different in spirit. They had seen another way of life, one that shattered the lies they had been taught. They had learned that democracy was not chaos but order, that freedom did not lead to famine but to abundance, that kindness could come even from an enemy. And they carried that knowledge back with them. Historians later called it America's quiet victory. Without meaning to, without planning it, the United States had turned hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers into witnesses of its strength, not through speeches, but through food. The dinner table had done what guns could not. It had softened hearts, reshaped minds, and planted seeds for a future alliance. Many of those same POWs would go on to become leaders, workers, and fathers in the new West Germany, the Germany that would rise as a democratic ally of the United States during the Cold War. Some would later say that their first taste of democracy was not in a voting booth, but in a slice of pumpkin pie at an American Thanksgiving. For America, the memory was mixed. Some guards never forgot the bitterness of watching prisoners eat better than their own families. Some towns never forgave the sight of enemy soldiers sitting at their tables. Yet others remembered the friendships formed, the strange bonds that grew from shared work and shared meals. In quiet corners of Texas, Nebraska, and Wisconsin, stories still linger of German prisoners who returned years later as free men, bringing their wives and children to meet the farm families who once fed them. The numbers remain striking. Across those years, the average German prisoner in America gained 20 to 30 pounds. Many gained much more. One man ballooned from 128 to 185 pounds in just 2 years, a staggering 57 pounds. The irony was inescapable. The enemy, behind barbed wire, grew stronger and healthier than the families who had defeated him. And yet, perhaps that was the truest measure of America's strength. Not in bombs, not in battles, but in bread. In the choice to feed an enemy as well as a friend. In the decision to follow the rules of the Geneva Convention when others would not. In the abundance that made generosity possible. The German POWs, in America, left behind more than empty mess halls and silent barracks. They left behind a story that still astonishes those who hear it. A story of men who arrived starving and left well fed. A story of irony so sharp, borders on unbelievable. A story where the simple act of gaining 50 pounds became a symbol of something far greater. The triumph of abundance over scarcity, kindness over cruelty, democracy over tyranny. And so, when we look back on the great battles of World War II, the beaches of Normandy, the deserts of Africa, the forests of the Ardennes, we should also remember the quieter battle, fought not with guns, but with food. It was fought in mess halls and farm fields, around dinner tables and holiday feasts. It was fought with butter and bread, with turkey and pie, with coffee and Coca-Cola. And in its own way, it may have been one of America's greatest victories, because when the war was over, the German prisoners went home heavier, healthier, and carrying with them a truth that no regime could erase, that America was not starving, not weak, not broken, that America was a land of plenty, that even its prisoners could live better than free men elsewhere. And that truth, planted quietly in the minds of 425,000 men, may have done more for the cause of democracy than anyone realized at the time. For, in the end, the story of the German POWs in America is not just about the 50 pounds they gained. It is about what that weight meant. It is about how a nation showed its power, not only in war, but in mercy. It is about how bread and butter became tools of peace. And it is about how, in the darkest years of the 20th century, America fed its enemies until they could no longer believe the lies they had once sworn to fight for. And that is a story worth remembering.